All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are cracking open a 70-year-old cold case that, believe it or not, has everything to do with what's on your plate every single day. Yeah, we're talking about the massive, decades-long war between fat and sugar.
And at the center of this whole thing is one man, the physiologist Ancel Keys. If you've spent any time online looking into nutrition, you've probably heard this. The accusation is explosive, that he's the guy, the architect of our modern health crisis, who pointed the finger at fat and sent us all down the wrong path.
But is it really that simple? Is one person to blame for everything? Well, when it comes to science and our health, the viral story is almost never the whole story. So let's do this. Let's actually investigate the charges, separate the myths from the facts, and figure out what this 70-year fight really means for how we eat right now.
Okay, Exhibit A, the main charge against Ancel Keys, the idea that he totally manipulated his most famous piece of research, the 7-country study, to frame an innocent nutrient, fat.
So, the story you've probably heard goes like this. He committed straight-up scientific fraud, right? He supposedly had data from 22 countries, but cherry-picked the 7 that perfectly fit his theory. The historical record, though, it's a bit more complicated. He did present a chart with just a handful of countries, and yeah, it showed a super strong link. But when other researchers later looked at all 22 countries, the link didn't just vanish. It was weaker, for sure, but it was still there, statistically speaking. So it's less a case of just making things up and, well, maybe more a case of really wanting your theory to be true.
So, while it wasn't outright fraud, we have to be honest. The study had some pretty serious flaws. I mean, collecting diet data in Greece during Lent, a time of fasting, or trying to figure out what all of America eats based on what people remember from a single day, those are huge issues. And the biggest one of all, it was an observational study. All that can ever do is show a potential connection, a correlation. It can't prove, not for a second, that one thing actually causes the other.
But hold on. If fat wasn't the lone gunman, you have to ask, was there another culprit? And was that culprit being protected? Well, that brings us to our next suspect, Big Sugar.
And this timeline is just wild. It shows you exactly how the story we were all told was shaped behind the scenes. Way back in 1972, this scientist, John Yudkin, was basically screaming from the rooftops that sugar was the real danger. But his work got buried. Why? Well, it took until 2016 for a major medical journal to uncover a secret campaign by the sugar industry to point the blame squarely on fat.
And how did they do it? With money. For about $50,000 in today's money, the Sugar Research Foundation paid Harvard scientists to publish a review paper. And guess what it said? It said the evidence against sugar wasn't so strong, but hey, you should really be worried about saturated fat. That one paper helped set the entire public health agenda for decades.
And all that time, the very evidence Yudkin was talking about just kept piling up. We now have modern studies showing that people who get more than a quarter of their calories from added sugar have a 3 times higher risk of dying from heart disease. 3 times.
But look, to be totally fair here, the sugar industry wasn't the only one with money in the game. Ancel Keys and the American Heart Association, they got millions from companies like Procter & Gamble, the makers of Crisco. They had a very clear financial reason to promote vegetable oils as the healthy alternative to things like butter. So yeah, there was money and influence on all sides of this thing.
So after looking at all this evidence, the sketchy studies, the industry money, what's the verdict? Well, it turns out the biggest mistake of all was how the question was framed from the very beginning.
What we had was a classic false dilemma. It's a logical fallacy where you're presented with only 2 choices, as if those are the only options. It must be fat's fault, or it must be sugar's fault. But science today tells us that was never the right way to look at it. The real story is so much more complex. It's not an either-or. And this table really helps us move past that old blame game. Look at the reality. Saturated fat, it's not automatically the bad guy. Its effect really depends on what you're eating instead of it. And vegetable oils, they're not serial killers. Unprocessed ones are actually good for you. The real villain there is industrial trans fats. And sugar,
Yeah, it's definitely a major contributor to disease, but it's not the only thing going on.
You hear this all the time online, right? That sugar and seed oils are responsible for 8 out of 10 modern diseases? That is a gigantic claim, and frankly, it's a huge exaggeration. So, if that's not it, what does the best global data actually say are our biggest problems when it comes to diet? The answer is probably not what you think.
Check this out. This chart is based on the massive Global Burden of Disease study, one of the most comprehensive looks at this stuff ever, and it paints a totally different picture. Our biggest dietary risks aren't just single nutrients we eat too much of. It's the good, protective foods we're not eating enough of. Diets low in whole grains, low in fruit, low in veggies, low in nuts and seeds, and yeah, too high in sodium. It's more about what's missing from our plates.
Okay, so what do we do with all this? After this whole messy, complicated history, how can we use this to actually make better choices today?
Well, the scientific consensus today isn't about banning entire food groups. It's actually about some pretty clear principles. 1, cut back on added sugars. 2, be smart about your fats. Swap some saturated fats for unsaturated ones from things like olive oil or avocados. 3, get industrial trans fats out of your diet, period. They are the real villains. And maybe the most important one of all, 4, focus on your overall dietary pattern. A diet based on whole, minimally processed foods is what really truly matters more than obsessing over any single nutrient.
And, after this whole 70-year saga, it leaves you with this one final critical question. For decades, we pointed the finger at fat. Then we swung the pendulum all the way over and pointed it at sugar. But maybe, the real enemy was never the fat or the sugar itself. Maybe the villain is what we do to them. Maybe it's the industrial processing that strips them down and turns them into the ultra-refined ingredients that form the basis of so many of our modern health problems. Now that is some real food for thought.